Luis, could you tell us what was the impetus for Beyond Winning Smart Parenting in a Toxic Sports Environment?
Leanne, it started with me going on a radio show called The ABCs of Sports, which was hosted by a gentleman by the name of Scott Lancaster. And when I went on that show, he talked with me and with others about the problems with youth sport, how askew the paradigm is, and how kids are having a ruinous experience psychologically, physically, psychologically with how they get damaged and their self-worth is jarred. Physically, a recent study just came out, 3.5 million injuries in youth sports, some of them as core as, torn ACLs. The kinds of injuries that professional athletes used to have almost exclusively are now occurring to 9, 10, and 11-year-old boys and girls. And that's shocking, and it's problematic, and it's a pandemic. And so the passion with which Scott approached these issues and talked to people as variant as Kevin Bacon and Dr. Robert Cantu, the leading expert on concussions in the world, and doctors and journalists such as myself, the passion with which he spoke called me to want to work with him in a way that wasn't just journalistic, wasn't just reporting on steroid issues and parents. I wrote a story once about a parent who had given his child human growth hormone and testosterone from the age of 13 to make him a special athlete. And one time when I went on a show on CNN, I actually was asked by a makeup artist whether it was okay for her husband to be pushing her diminutive son to use human growth hormone because the father wanted him to become a baseball player, and he was 5'2", and his father thought that this wouldn't be big and tall enough for him to have a chance. Now, of course, the woman speaking to me was 4'9", and the husband was 5'4" at most. And in this kind of experience, I was going on that show to discuss a gentleman by the name of Chris Benoit, a Canadian wrestler with WrestleMania and the World Wrestling Federation, who that very weekend had killed his wife and son and hung himself, having been confused and discombobulated by a mix of painkillers, drugs, steroids, all kinds of stuff that he was taking, sort of a cocktail of pharmaceutical madness. And so this is all swirling in my mind as I do this work with Scott, and then I started co-hosting the show. And simultaneously, at my children's school, I heard a lecture by a gentleman by the name of King John Payne, who is the author of Simplicity Parenting, and a movement based on that book, which tries to slow things down and to give children and parents the breathing space to experience life at an appropriate, child-friendly pace. And I thought of these two gentlemen and how one was mainstream but revolutionary in his tirade against the machine, which is youth sports and professional sports in general. And the other one was very niche in his study of Waldorf and Rudolf Steiner and his working with kids in refugee areas and then working with children in the US and realizing that the difference between the war-torn, war-scarred psyches of little kids in Rwanda and those in Manhattan or even in Albany or Marion County, California, was not that different. There were similarities in the stress level of these children. And I talked with each one of them about the possibility of us doing a partnership, and that's how the whole child sports movement was formed. It is still in its nascent stage, but the first thing we did is start to meet and discuss our ideas, which in many ways are variant. I mean, Scott is about developing youth sports programs. He worked with the NFL for 11 years. I have been crisscrossing the world reporting in different ways as an investigative journalist and an athlete profilist. And Kim has been the parenting troubadour, going from town to town and from city to city, talking about simplifying our lives for ourselves and our children. The three of us got together and the energy was just buzzing. Every time we met up in a small town named Harlemville in Kim's neck of the woods, we just couldn't stop. It turned into 2 or 3 days of nonstop talking and ideas, and that's how the conceptualization of Beyond Winning came. And of course, we titled it Whole Child Sports, and then our publisher, once one signed on, said, well, what about Beyond Winning? And it felt just right, because that's what we're about. This movement is about seeking something that's larger than the outcome, which we as parents and kids and professional athletes care too much about. It's all about that score. And it's not just about the score of life, it's about what it is really the score of today's game. And frankly, when you take a bunch of kids and they have a game and they're intense and they will lose and cry, or they win and celebrate, or both, 5 minutes after the game, if you ask those kids what they felt about the game or what's going on, 9 out of 10 of them won't even want to answer you. They've moved on. They want to go get a pizza, hang out, see a ball game, or God knows what else. They just want to connect in another way. They've had fun and they're moved on, or they've lost and overcome it. But parents, and we say this in the book in one scene that we paint about an AAU tournament, parents for hours and hours argue with each other about the referee and whether it was fair to have changed the rules in this particular tournament. Wow, I mean, why can't we let go the way the kids are? And what are we creating as conditions in which they will model after us this intensity and this unnecessary fanaticism about, victory today? What does it matter when you're 24 and can't walk well that you killed yourself at the age of 11 to try and make a travel team? And that in the context of the fact that 1% of 1% of players ever make it to the pros, and only 1% of high-profile high school athletes even play in Division I college sports, and yet we're all chasing the economics of a scholarship. There aren't that many scholarships, and there's a bottleneck of millions of kids who have their parents pressing them to become something which they don't necessarily even want. Mm-hmm. And so Kim, Scott, and I are in 100% agreement that children want connection. They just want to connect with their parents, and they want attention from their parents. And whether the parent knows it or not, we're projecting on them all these anxieties and fears. They're not afraid, they're not anxious, they want to have fun. And we superimpose this sort of malformed structure on them, and then suddenly they are worried about winning and worried about this and that, and then they see it on television and they see it in different ways manifest, and now all they care about is winning and making fun of each other. We have a whole chapter on bullying and hazing and teasing, and that happens only in this kind of a culture where winning means more than anything.
But it's interesting, if you talk to any of those parents that you've just described, they don't, and they won't admit, most of them, that they are part of the main problem. So how do you... Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't that fascinating? That's one of the most, both touching and invigorating parts of the discovery of this process as we've been writing the book. And I mean, Kim's been around this for many years, and Scott's seen this for 40 years. My eyes have been opened to this more recently. And we have a chapter 2, which is titled, Your Sports Biography, Does It Hinder or Help? And we're not talking about kids there. This is directed right to the parents. The question is, are you, because of what occurred to you when you were a kid, how your parent treated you, how they did or didn't care about a sport, are you then, unbeknownst to you, without mindfulness, if you'll excuse that term, which has become a big buzzword, but it's important, are you creating conditions and anxiety in your child without knowing it? So if you were a top lacrosse player and a Division I champion, why then do you think that your child, who is a separate being from you, necessarily wants to also be that? Why are you taking him at the age of 8 to cross training, to lacrosse camp in the summer for 8 weeks, and then to play lacrosse in the fall, and then lacrosse training in the winter break, and then lacrosse March spring break training in Florida where it's warm enough if you're from Massachusetts, and then again in the spring he's playing the regular season? And why are you in a doctor's office a few months later and the kid is crying and faking an injury? This is what's happening in America, all across, on all levels, with all sports. So this book for us is both a wake-up call, though other journalists have done this, and perhaps even better. The Tom Ferries with Game On, and Mark Hyman with The Most Expensive Game in Town, and Until It Hurts. Great stories and great books have been written about the problems with youth sport. So we didn't just want to highlight them, we wanted to offer solutions. That's where Kim and Scott and their collective 40 to 50 years of experience in the fields of therapy, counseling, parental advice, sports program development, movement training, balance training, and me with what I've seen of the world in the different sort of social structures of sport, whether it be baseball in the Dominican Republic, or boxing in Tijuana, or golf in Paraguay, or Venezuela, or anywhere in the US. We've all seen the different permutations of the cultural insanity, which is high performance demand of kids in youth sports, and the industrial complex, the machine, if you will, referring to Pink Floyd, which eats up our children, destroys them, spits them out as young adults who are either maimed in some way through injury or wounded psychologically in a sense that they carry on for decades and decades, and then inflict on their own children because they haven't fully processed what happened to them. There is one thing that a pair of parents told us once was, well, you know, we never pressured our child to play sports. I was a professor and my wife was a doctor. We wanted them to have fun, and my son was fantastic at soccer, so we supported him, but we never pressed him. So these parents think that they didn't really have a sports narrative, at least a negative one from their parents. So that's fine, their kids should be okay. Well, that's a myth, because if they are not involved in the sports path of their child, then what they are doing is deferring to the coaches. And that's another key, and that's why we talk about this expression, you are your child's first coach, because you're the steward of your child's life. And as Kim says often, you wouldn't give your 8-year-old the keys to your car. They don't have the ability to deal with that technology. Well, young children don't have the ability to deal with adult egos, coach egos, and performance issues and self-worth. So if you think that because you don't have a storied or negative sporting experience and are not foisting on your child, but then you give your child up to the coaches of the world, we can guarantee you from our many, many years of experience and observation that the odds are probably 100 to 1 that you'll get a kind of coach who is expansive and self-aware enough to treasure and teach your child in an appropriate way, and to be able to deal with an entire group of kids and their childlike parents who are demanding different agendas and foisting them upon the coach and your child. It's a fascinating world, but there's much sadness in it, and we hope through Whole Child Sports and through this book and through subsequent books about coaching and more specific webinars that we'll do to help shed some light on this.